This video is a review of the Penguin book on migration literature. I love this book for a number of reasons. Number one, the type of books like that are very rich. They are not about one argument, not about one part of the world, not about one viewpoint that's being put on the topic in concern. They are intended to be reference books, meaning that you have multiple arguments, different angles from which you address the topic in concern. One of these feasts, if you'd like, of thinking that are offered to us as readers, typically on topics that are of importance. That richness, I think, make this type of books fascinating for readers who are intellectually inclined, those who want to have multiple ideas to pick and choose from, and almost certainly you'll find ideas that you say, absolutely, that is a great idea. You'll find arguments that you support, and in books of that nature you find arguments that you abhor, not just disagree with. So in essence, books like that are amalgamation of different views from different parts of the world about different parts of the world, all of that revolving around one theme, I find fascinating and rich. And this book does not disappoint. It fits that type of description. The second reason I like books of that nature is that they are typically not books that you have to read in one specific period, let's say a week, that you have to follow from A to Z. No, because it is an aggregation of a number of essays, multiple viewpoints about the topic in concern, you can dig into that type of books whenever you want to and at whatever angle you want, or from whatever angle you want to, at whatever essay you want to dig into. So let's say you want, in this case, to look at a specific essay on migration related to the Middle East. You're able to jump into the essay about that as opposed to follow the essays in the book in the order the editor put them in. The other reason I really like this book is that the topic it is about, migration, is obviously these days super important. It is arguably the most important political dossier in the entirety of Europe. It's a very relevant issue and prominent issue in American politics. In the Middle East, the idea of, not just of migration, but is of dislocation, of refugees, of the impact on host communities. All of these topics are very important in different countries in the Middle East. So migration is hugely important these days. And yet, this book hardly focuses on migration from a political point of view, certainly not from an economic point of view. Rather, like all books of that nature that are grand reference books about a topic, it goes into it from a humanistic point of view, from a cultural point of view. It touches on politics, it touches on economics, but fundamentally it's about cultures, viewpoints, perceptions of the topic in concern, here migration. Another point that I think is very good about this book is that in the past 20-25 years, in the era of globalization, especially before 2008, before the financial crisis, in globalization, one of the most important notions that were promulgated and promoted by politics all over the world and by the political economy, the prevailing political economy in different parts of the world, was the idea of the world opening up. In Europe, there was the notion of free movement. In the world, free movement was not really there, but certainly the ability of labor, especially talented, highly talented labor, to move from one region of the world to another, to interact, to work somewhere else. Of course, the huge dominance of multinational companies and banks across the global economy, all of that meant there is this notion of opening up. The financial crisis of 2008 and the austerity policies that resulted from that, and of course today COVID. But even before COVID, the last 10, 12 years saw austerity policies again, so the rise of right-wing groups across the world and primarily in the West actually. All of that brought with it skepticism, often hostility to the notion of migration and to the notion of this opening up. Some people would argue we have been seeing in the last 10 years some sort of closing down, not just of the economic aspects of trade and investment, but rather of the human interaction between different cultures and societies. This book, because it looks at migration not from a political economy point of view, not from trade and economics, but rather from a cultural point of view, I think it's very relevant today, at least as a counterpart, thinking-wise, to some of the ideas we see gaining momentum in different parts of the world against, not necessarily migration, but against the idea of opening up to the world. I will not go into the details of the essays entailed in that book because that's the richness of it, and I think any kind of summary of books of that nature become a bit silly, so I will not do that. What I will do is try to highlight 2 or 3 aspects I think make this book really rich, apart from the aggregation of essays about migration from different parts of the world, from different thinkers, from different cultures. One, that the book is hardly, most of the essays are hardly about the places from which migration originated or the places to which the migration in concern ended up. So it's not about the place from which people came from or the place to which they went and settled. It is about the people. It is about the migrant, him or herself. And it is about, as you would expect from a book about cultures and the humanistic aspects of it, it is about the experiences. Of course, part of that is the experiences of nostalgia, of memory, and of the encounter with the new place, with the new culture. And therefore the place obviously has a role to play here and features in the thinking in that book. But the real emphasis in most of the essays, I would say, is on the experience of the migrant. And I think that makes it much more relatable to, by far, many readers than the parts about the place. Because you might know one place very well. You might have an interest in another place. You might be intrigued by a third place. But at the end of the day, what all of us will relate to much more is or are the experiences of the migrants. And this focus on the experiences, on the memories, not of the place, the shape of the memory itself, the evolution of the memory itself, on the perceptions, again, not necessarily of the place, but in diving into how perceptions are shaped in people's minds, in the change of consciousness of people through this incredibly rich experience of uprooting your place from one area and putting it down, putting roots, establishing roots somewhere else. Memory, perception, again, consciousness. To me, that is super rich, and I think many readers would relate to much more than they would do to talks, even very reflective and rich writings or talks about places. The second point, which I think makes this book richer, is that it is not just about individual or familial movements, migrations. probably the bigger part actually, is about communal migrations, the movement of big communities from one place or one part of the world to another. Of course, there's a lot of heaviness, some people will say sadness, entailed into this, because in the vast majority of cases, when you had communities migrating, that usually meant either acute economic problems or that they were forced to move. So you have this sadness and this heaviness there, which again enriches the book. But the point I'm trying to say is that this book is also trying to address the collective thinking of a community, the collective experience and transformation of consciousness of a community, rather than just the microprism of one person or the experience of a family. And that is also, to my mind, a source of richness. The related point here, and maybe third or fourth point on why this book is really rich, is that in doing so, in addressing this community movement and migration, the book avoids the trap of falling into the politics. Meaning, whenever you have an experience in which big communities moved from one place to another, especially if they were forced to do that, the politics are a crucial aspect of that story, for good reason. But to address the politics seriously and fairly, almost always, you have to address multiple viewpoints, different rationales. If you do that in a book of this nature on the migration literature, you will end up consuming a big part of the book on the politics of it, which means that the book will end up being a political book, which is not the reason here. To a very large extent, again, this is a book about the human, the culture, and the intellectual aspect of the theme in concern. So the book touches, of course, on politics in some essays, but what it does very well is to eschew, as they say, to leave aside the politics and to a very large extent try to dig deep into the experience of the community, the changes in the intellect, in the memory, in the collective memory, in the perceptions of and traditions of that community, and of course again into the consciousness, the collective consciousness of that community, which feeds into even a wider consciousness of the place they have gone to, rather than the book being sucked into the multiple narratives of politics. The final point, which I think makes books of this nature, these big reference books, important and I think valuable, is that typically it is very costly, very financially costly and difficult really to bring 10, 15, 20 different narratives by different thinkers from different parts of the world, different cultures, into one book and edit that and present it to the world in a price that is relatively affordable. And therefore, only big houses, publishing houses, presses that are able to do that. And when a publishing house does that, I think it is a valuable effort. And it's some sort of a contribution to the thinking world in general and to whoever is interested in the theme in concern here, migration. It is a book I would recommend not just for scholars of sociology and political economy, but I would say for anyone interested in how this super important theme of migration, of interculture or cultural exchanges, particularly at this point in time when the openness of the world over the past 20-25 years is being threatened, it is an important contribution and I would recommend it.